Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your attending this. This is our second session, and we're thrilled to have you here. We hope that you get a lot of great information out of it, as we always do, even ourselves. So, and you know, our style is not lecture style, but open table. So stop at any point and ask questions if you have them, and that's why we have name tags there, so we can call on you by name. And if I spell your name incorrectly, I apologize.
And I can't read the names from here, so I
So yeah,
apologize ahead of time.
there's not a reading exam, thank goodness, or an exam after this. Anyway, my name is Tony Guthrie. I'm with Robert Paul Properties, and we've got my partner Sharon and Mabile. I'm really thrilled to have everybody here. This is the second one of these that we've done. And before we introduce the entire panel, one of the many reasons why we started doing these is because as the selling market continues to change in real estate, and the buyer pool continues to change, and it's changed tremendously. I mean, even if you look at the way you buy things yourselves, whether you're going on Amazon to buy something or whatever the case may be, it has changed dramatically over the past 10, 3, 5 years and changed, and it's exponentially changing more quickly. The biggest buying pool of people that are coming out these days are the millennials, believe it or not. There's a lot of young wealth out there. There's, there certainly is a nice demand for real estate, but one of the things we want to talk to, we're going to be covering several different subjects today. One of the things we're going to talk about is the fact that there's a big difference between primary home buying and secondary home buying. And the Cape is very much a secondary home buying market. Not everyone needs a place to live, but not everyone needs a second home. So it's very discretionary. So the emotion behind it, the demand behind it is very different. And when people ask us, or even people in general say, how's the real estate market? Or when you see these reports on TV that say, you know, the national average is up 30% or 20% or whatever numbers they say nationally, real estate couldn't be more geographically driven from the standpoint of what's happening in Boston is not necessarily happening here. But the good news is the trends that happen in Boston, the Cape usually follows, 3 years behind or so. But again, Boston is a primary market. They're also very heavily influenced by the international market. And believe it or not, there's a lot of wealthy international people that are coming to Boston. Their children are going to, Harvard or MIT or wherever, and these people are buying them $2 and $3, $4 million condos to live in while they go to school, because no matter what's going on in the world, people still feel that the real estate health in the United States is very good. As it relates to the Cape, and even more specifically the Lower Cape, it comes down to, one of the things that I specifically, and I think Sharon joins me in this, is that it's always been location, location, location. And that's what's driven, a lot of thought over the years. And that has changed dramatically. The biggest change is that it's now all about price, condition, and location, especially in the secondary market, because as we become more of an instantaneous world of push a button and you get something in 24 hours or less, people are less apt to want to take on a project. Young people that have wealth, and even middle-aged people and people that have gone through projects might not be as inclined to take on a project. So there are times, more often than not, people will go after price and condition over location. And that's one of the biggest shifts out there, because again, it goes back to timing and things like that, and it ties back into pricing. But before we get into any more of that, I do want to introduce the panel, because we've got what we've done over the years. Sharon and I have been doing real estate full-time for about 7 years. I've had my license for 25. Prior to that, I was in the resort business. I managed this place for 12 years. Chatham Bars Inn for 10. Witchmere for a year. We've been through several renovations and changes. Sharon's background is in teaching and also in hospitality, has been doing real estate for about the same time. We've teamed up about 3 years ago now, and over the course of our careers, we've been fortunate enough to meet and work with some very highly skilled professionals. And so in the real estate world of transactions and keeping things simple and one-stop shopping, we have this select group of people that we work with that are go-to experts all the time for things, because the Cape, as we all know, is very quirky. And the quirkiness of it has, a lot of regulations have changed and a lot of different nuances that if you haven't sold in a couple of years, you wouldn't know about. So Karen Jennings-Flynn is an attorney that we use all the time, has an office here in Sharon. Karen, I'm going to let everyone tell a little bit about herself, so your background and things like that.
All right. I've been practicing for more than 30 years. I was development counsel for the Boston Redevelopment Authority at the beginning of my career. Then when I started my family, the commute into Boston, I was living west of Boston at the time, and the commute into Boston was a drag, and after resigning 5 times, they finally believed me. And I started a small practice just out of my house at that time, just to stay in touch with the real estate. Not as much commercial work as I was doing originally, and sort of transitioned into the residential because that allowed me to do it all, supposedly, and be around for my daughters while they were growing. My daughters are all grown up now. I maintain a practice outside of Boston. I live in Sherburne, which is right outside of Boston, and have an office down here on the Cape. So I commute back and forth, and have been doing real estate in Chatham actually for about 25 years. I had a client who lived off Cape but invested in several properties in Chatham in particular. So that's how I sort of ended up having an office in Chatham. And again, I specialize just in the real estate.
And the beauty of Karen is she's mobile, and I've never really worked with an attorney. Sharon and I have that. We'll drive to your house to have documents signed, and very easy to work with, and she makes her schedule and work with your schedule, which is
well, that was part of my gig when I started solo practice. 30 years ago, there weren't a lot of women doing solo practices, and I had to distinguish myself somehow from the bigger downtown firms. And I found that if, the realtors, for even back then, were available 24/7, so I found that if I made myself available, the same type of thing, because real estate happens on weekends, and you need to be able to get in touch with whoever it is you need to get in touch with, and your attorney, or your realtor, whoever. So that's how it is, and that's how I've done it, and it seems to work for some people in the market.
Thanks, Karen. John Bologna is the president of Coastal Engineering. John and I have worked together for 25 years, and again, John is the kind of guy in his team I can call at 9 o'clock at night or Sunday morning or whenever if I have a question about anything that has to do with engineering. And so, John, why don't you tell you a little bit about yourself and your company?
Well, we don't like the Sunday morning calls too much.
Yeah, no. Try it.
We make ourselves available, yeah. Well, Coastal Engineering has been in business for over 40 years. We're located in Orleans, our main office. We recently opened up branch offices in Sandwich as well as Nantucket. We provide full scope services in the engineering profession, structural, civil primarily, as well as land surveying, environmental permitting, and wastewater operations. So with, especially these days with the very environmentally sensitive areas, the need for advanced wastewater treatment processes are important. And so we do innovative alternative waste treatment systems as well as waterfront engineering. So for shorefront protection, we've been very busy with all the storms here recently. And people are very concerned about how that impacts their properties, both in terms of shore protection as well as changes in flood maps and how that impacts their properties. So we've been looking at a lot of flood risk mitigation here recently with both in terms of the shore protection end of it as well as impacts on their buildings and as well as their their properties. And colleagues here at Rogers and Gray will talk about the insurance side of things, but we look at the engineering piece of it and what can be done from a flood risk management piece of it, whether that means elevating the building or waterproofing, floodproofing, or possibly relocating structures, if that's kind of part of the overall strategy. So that's...
And the other part that we'll get into at a certain point, many of you may over the years have done work on your homes or and things like that, and oftentimes by the time a project ends, some of the loose ends don't get tied up, like orders of condition and things that are really important, because when the house goes, and when a house is held for 20, 30 years, or even 5, 10 years, and there's been work done, and someone goes to sell it, oftentimes a lot of hiccups come along the way if you haven't gone down, and that's where a guy like John comes in handy, because he makes sure that orders of condition and things like that are all signed off on, whether it's DPW or Conservation Commission or whatever. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Joe Rossi is with Rogers and Gray. I work with Rogers and Gray, and many of them may have Rogers and Gray, but probably one of the most outstanding local insurance companies there is on the Cape. And Joe, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you'll be talking about?
Sure. So I'm the flood specialist for Rogers and Gray. So we've heard about the engineering side of what goes on with flood. I'll talk a little bit about the insurance side, and I do interrelate all the time. So I'll be talking a little bit about the insurance side when it comes to flood and what you need to know.
Great. Thank you very much. And David Murphy is with Tobey Riley. David, his firm does great construction work, minor renovations and things like that. And David's going to talk a little bit at some point about some of the things that you can do to, whether it's gussy up your house for a sale, and some of the things that some of the pitfalls. And Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit about your company?
Yeah, I want to first thank Tony for the invite, my first rodeo here, but I'm the Director of Operations for Tobey Leary Fine Woodworking. I've known the owner, Tobey Leary, for over 15 years. I've been in both residential and commercial construction for the last 25 years. A cool little piece about Tobey and I, we both grew up on the Cape. Tobey grew up in Dennis, I grew up in Yarmouth-Port. We both went to the Cape Cod Tech Regional School. Spent years there trying to figure out what we wanted to do with our lives, and kind of fell into the trades, and over the years it's really paid off. We love what we do. We love wood. We're wood purists, but more importantly, we love the relationship with the homeowner and helping them assist in whatever their project needs. So we do quite a bit. We have an architectural millwork division of the company, which is very strong, and that's kind of why Tobey Leary Fine Woodworking is very obvious in the logo. But again, a lot of experience in owning and maintaining a residential property here in the Cape and the conditions, and so we'd be happy to help with any of that.
And Dave's also good enough to be speaking on behalf of Leo Cabana, who was going to be here today, but he had to have knee surgery, and someone canceled for their knee surgery, so it bumped him up the list. So right now he is getting his knee replaced as we speak. So, and Leo, and this is Leo's part is a really important part, so we can all speak on it, and that's moisture, mold, mildew, which is so very prevalent on the Cape, and there are some very easy ways to go about fixing those and remedying those things. But before we get into that, we have Mike Redfield from Rogers and Gray as well.
Yeah, my name is Ryan O'Connell. I've worked at Rogers and Gray for about 16 years now. We have 9 offices. We just bought our 9, so that's why it's not stuck in my head. I mean, we have offices from Norwell to Sandwich, Falmouth, Hyannis, Dennis, Wareham. The one we recently purchased was in Nantucket. That was about a year and a half ago, as well as Dennis and Orleans. I've been through the insurance industry when for those of us that have lived here on the Cape, we saw it all fall apart about 12, 13 years ago with the reinsurance world and the prices we're all starting to pay. So I've seen the pain and felt the pain, so I can speak on all behalfs of that.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to talk a little bit about the market in 2011 17. You know, why we're here today is hopefully to educate you if you're in the midst of wanting to sell your home, planning on selling your home in the near future. Home selling is stressful at the very minimum. And if you haven't done it in a while, it can get extraordinarily stressful and overwhelming. And one of the reasons why, Sharon, I wanted to do this is to say that we've collaborated with this group of professionals because we all work really well together, number one. We're all available to each other. There's certain companies that operate in vacuums, but when you're, it's kind of like, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, sometimes it takes a village, to sell real estate on the Cape, and simply because, as I said in the beginning, it's a luxury buy. Whether you're selling a $200,000 home or a $20 million home, for that person and that price point, it's discretionary, and it's kind of their dream to buy a home on the Cape. And so, in doing so, you as the seller want to be as prepared as possible. And there was a time, certainly when I started buying homes, that I was all about having a project and putting my stamp on it. Well, that's completely reversed, where people today are like, we want it done, turnkey, and we'll take all the furniture too, and just take your toothbrush and, get the hell out kind of.
I think the big picture message for us, for you guys today, is just that it's a very different experience now to sell a house than it was not very long ago. And we continually run into people who are overwhelmed sometimes with the surprise factor of, oh, I have to worry about that, and oh, I didn't think about that. And so what we want to do for you today is sort of broadly educate you as to some of the issues that you might have to contend with, give you tools and resources with how to address those issues, and answer any questions that you may have that pertain to those, or anything else that we didn't think of.
And kind of take the fear factor out of it, because it's all very, there are going to be small things and big things, and again, you've got questions, ask away. Karen?
And I just want to add to that, because despite the fact that it has changed, and it has changed significantly in the last 5 to 7 years, it's still a process, and surrounding yourself with a team that knows the process, and doing this, exactly what you're doing today, getting sort of ahead of it. You're thinking of maybe selling, getting yourself familiar with the process, so that once you're into it, it's very much a hurry up and wait situation. And there are times where you're going to need to be able to make a decision, and you're going to need to be able to make it quickly. So if you have familiarized yourself with the process, you'll have the tools in place to be able to make those decisions quickly. Because I think you guys would agree, there's nothing that kills a deal faster than time. And you really want to respect whatever the time frame is. And as sellers, I always encourage you to meet whatever your buyer's closing date is. The sooner you get, once you're under an offer, the sooner you close, the better it is, because stuff happens, life happens. Hurricanes happen, nor'eathers happen, property gets damaged.
Yeah, and again, because it's back to being discretionary, it's all about getting the deal done. By the way, the more exciting part of this program is there's fresh cookies and brownies back there. Please feel free to jump up and get one anytime. We're going to talk about kind of what happened, what was going on in the Lower Cape. When we talk about the Lower Cape, we talk about Harwich, Orleans, Brewster, Chatham area. And this is just in general terms, anything up to 500,000. Sales were down primarily because of inventory. There was a direct correlation with inventory. Inventory is very, very low in that price point because there's a lot of new young home buyers coming to the market. There's also a lot of investment buying, people that are buying second homes to either rent out or things like that. Under a point in the 500,000 to $1 million. And again, that was largely driven by lack of inventory. If we had more, we would have sold more. And Sharon and I have seen in the past few days that we've put houses on that have gone right under because they're priced well and they're put together well, and we get people ready for the unveiling. The biggest thing that was down on this was not because of an inventory problem necessarily, was the $1 million plus and the $2 million plus. And the reasons behind that, it's interesting, and on your table, you can take these home, and I encourage you to do so, because it's a 44-page report of not just the Cape, but Boston, the suburbs of Boston, and they all really do intertwine with each other, and to some degree. While these two market segments were down in the lower Cape, the upper Cape and mid Cape saw, double-digit increases, which would tell us, or the way we extrapolated it anyway, is that location isn't as important as value and getting more for your money, where Chatham can sometimes be known for, oh, you're going to Chatham, you're going to pay a lot of money. And so there's that, and so the whole lower Cape kind of, in that price segment, suffered a bit, because we've been on a ride over the past several years of it going up, prices kind of eking up, but sales being pretty robust. And every once in a while, there's an adjustment. Osterville felt it, about 5 years ago for 3 to 4 years, and now they're back doing really well. So that's why we get back into, when people, no matter how good or bad a market is, or time in an economy is, if your house is priced well and in great condition, it'll sell. It always comes down to pricing and right pricing. And on the Cape, it's probably one of the most difficult places to price a home, because if you're in a city, or if you're in a suburb, that area is like, oh, that's a square foot times a dollar amount, and that's what the house should, that's what those houses sell for. But on the Cape, you could have a house that is a $4 million house next to a house that's worth $500,000, and so it's hard to comp them out. So we have to broaden our comps, and there's nuances, and what that view right there behind you, for some people, is worth millions. For other people, it's worth something, but not as much as you would think. So it's very nuance driven, and that's where Sharon and I come in to do as much research as we can on comps, and offer suggestions as to how best market your house. And again, I encourage you to take these and read them, because I'm not going to bore you with all, and it's not boring information, but we've got a lot to cover, so I'd rather have you look at it. I will say this, though, the absorption rate on the Cape, and this is important, is much different than it is off Cape. So where we sometimes, a $2 million house can sometimes be on the market for up to 18 months, and that's not a long time in our world. If it's priced well, it can sell really quickly. If it's priced high, it might sit for a while. And there's always that mistake that sellers sometimes make, and say, let's start at this aspirational price and we can lower it. The problem with that is that it's like, your house is like fresh bread. And when it's out and fresh, it's great, people see it. But as new inventory comes on the market, people's attention starts waning to other things, and all of a sudden they'll see, that's been on for a while, let's wait and see. So it's, again, we'll talk a lot, I'll mention price a lot. But some of the bigger mistakes that sellers can sometimes make, certainly 77% of the time, overpricing. It's really important. Having your house available to show, we know that we always try to be amenable to people's schedules, and sometimes people have pets and things. We have a listing right now where the woman's dog just had puppies, so it's virtually impossible to see. We've had to turn away 4 showings, and at some point she'll wonder why our house hasn't sold. Cluttered space, we'll get into that with staging, because again, if you have a lovely home, and I'm sure all of you do have lovely homes, if there's too much stuff, whether it's beautiful stuff and artwork and pictures and knickknacks, it distracts the seller or the buyer from really concentrating on what they should be looking at, which is your home and not necessarily your things. They want to be able to picture their things in your home. And so, we work very hard on that with clients as far as staging goes. We'll come in and be, be kind and considerate, but give you honest feedback as to what should stay and what should go, because people in this day and age like clean line. They don't want to see a lot of collections and things like that, and those things are important to you, and that's great, but it might not be important to your consumer. The unwilling to negotiate, again, we, by law, any offers we are brought to us, by law, we have to present, no matter how low they may seem and feel, and our attitude is always, it doesn't matter where we start. What really matters is where we finish. And our goal, we work very hard at negotiating and working very hard for you as the seller. Unpleasant odors, cats, smoking, things like that, and that's where mold and mildew, just mix those words together. There's a house that we've had that, people are very sensitive to that, and that is, there's been some recent lawsuits with big hotel chains, and there's a lot more out there about mildew and mold, and there's some great easy remediation that can be done. And Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dave, because you and Leo work very hand in hand on that. And
absolutely, I completely agree. The environment, the home environment, is very important. Over the years, the studies of asthma, sickness. I mean, I had a client that lived in Oyster Harbors for 45 years that suffered and passed from lung cancer. His basement was full of toxic mold. He had mushrooms growing out of the carpet.
Oh my God.
So there's so many dynamics to uncover when it comes to homes. Homes are designed to breathe, bring in fresh air, pass air, and some people have the impression that sometimes tighter the better. Well, they're designed to have airflow. Children, lead paint was an issue, early on, where homes built prior to 1970 had to have lead paint, and the kids would go chew on a chair molding and get lead paint exposure. But people are very educated on the air quality of homes. They go into a home and they smell mildew, they're probably going to, bring that up.
Or smoke too. If there's any smokers in here and you're thinking of selling your house, stop now. No smoking in your houses anymore. Not in the garage.
The smoking's really taboo in this culture. So, I mean, it's taboo. These are things that go into the fiber of your home. Pets, smoking, carpets. These things they attract that scent, and you become benign to it for living in it for so long. But once you open the door to the public, it's all of a sudden very relevant that you may have moisture damage, mold issues, so on and so forth.
And so a good exercise for you all today is, when you think about when you started dating, whomever you started dating, you wore your best clothes, you're all gussied up. Today when I was getting ready, I typically lately don't wear a tie, but I wanted to wear a tie today because it's all about first impressions. And that's when you start dating each other, that's how it all is. And it's the same with your home. You buy your house, every little nick and scratch you're taking care of, and then as time goes on, it's like a pair of shoes. They get kind of nicked, and before you know it, don't worry about that, and there's some rotted wood up there in the corner, we'll take care of it. We got to get to that peeling paint, some more excess garbage in the garage or the basement. Those are the things, especially when you get to rotted wood trim and peeling paint, are turnoffs, because it says to the seller or to the buyer, and they'll never really come right out and say it, lack of care, lack of ownership, care, pride. And while it might not seem like it's like, that's been like that forever, it doesn't matter to the buyer. The buyers today want to come, drop their suitcases, and get to the beach or the bike path or wherever they want to go, because it's just a very different world.
I would really encourage you to just walk through your house with a different mindset. If you were walking into the house today to see if you wanted to buy your own home, what would you think? What would you notice? What would be drawn to your attention, and it's difficult sometimes to do that when you see your house every day, but if you can just really try to put a different hat on, and I speak from personal experience, I just sold my own house 6 months ago, and I had to do this. I mean, I loved my house, I lived in it for 18 years, but it finally got to the point where I said, okay, just like Tony said, there were things that I had neglected. There were a couple pieces of rotted wood on the trim outside, and peeling paint on the garage trim, and I'm thinking, well, who cares about that? Well, buyers care about that.
Not only buyers though,
And the inspector.
The bank, well, the inspector, the
Yeah.
buyer's inspector, but further down the process, when you're under purchase and sale and you've started packing, the bank, your buyer's lender, is going to send out an appraisal of the property. And depending on the type of loan it is, peeling paint can just kill it.
Right.
And rotted wood, so those things are.
Insurance companies care about it as well. So
Right,
it's kind of
true.
a whole gamut.
Right.
And again, it's not to overwhelm you and you have to have a brand new house, but it's good to just put a different mindset on and walk through your own space and ask yourself, if I were buying this house today, would this
What would
be
I
of
want
concern to
fixed?
me? What would I want fixed?
And because your home, like all of our homes, are, because they become emotional, we love them. They're our homes, memories, Christmases, and holidays, and all that, so all of a sudden, that becomes part of the equation. And so our jobs collectively is to help you navigate between the emotion of selling your house and the business of selling your house. And how we can, with doing some of what we're talking about today, some minor improvements and changes can yield more money for you long-term. It can take some of the speed bumps away from the process. We had, in our first seminar, we had a couple people that, came to the workshop, did some of the things we advised. They put their house on the market, and within a few days had multiple offers. We're not saying that's going to happen every time. And she was smart. She did some of the things we suggested that she do. She priced it well, and we, got it under contract, and we got a deal going for her. I would like to kind of talk a little bit about if you've done work. Is anybody, I'm sure many of you may have done work at your house, either fixing up a basement or stuff like that. I want Sharon and John to talk a little bit about if you've done work and you didn't necessarily get a permit, and trust me, half the people on the Cape don't necessarily get permits. It always comes up at the closing, because when they come to do the fire inspection for smoke inspection, smoke detectors, the fire chief has to note if a basement is finished or if something was changed in the house.
What happens really now also is the septic companies are now, every town is starting to pick up on this, they're required to present a floor plan of the house with the septic report. And so if the floor plan that they present doesn't match what's on file at the Board of Health, then that's when the red flags go up and they say, wait, what is this? When was this done? We don't have any record of this being permitted or being, signed off on or something. And so it can create a whole snowball effect of issues. And again, I just went through it myself. I had finished my own basement. I actually did think I had permitted when I did it, but apparently I didn't. So I went to sell my house and found out that I had an issue. It was a pretty big issue. So it's not that it can't be resolved, but it's better to know that ahead of time. Even before you put your house on the market, and you all have rights to your own building files. You can go to the town and ask to see it, see if there's anything that doesn't look right or that is open that hasn't been closed, and start asking the questions, what do I need to do to resolve this issue now? Because a buyer, when they've come to the table, they're excited about the house, even if it's an issue that can be resolved, they don't want to tackle that. It'll scare them away.
And it also will, it might put the fear in their mind, like, what else are we not finding out? What else is out there that's hidden? And, to Sharon's point, she had a couple of things that weren't, but she went to the town, they worked with her, they retroactively permitted items. We had another deal in Chatham, that same thing. People did, finish the basement in the 50s and put a bathroom in, and back then they were writing things on scrap pieces of paper and there was no filing system. So, and John, talk about orders of condition and things like that, because we had a couple deals like that where we were days away from closing and things that we thought were signed off on for years, were not. So John, why don't you talk about that?
Thank you for bringing that up. That is a big issue, particularly for folks who have properties that are on the waterfront or near any of the wetland resource areas. Any work that gets done within any of the wetland jurisdictions require permits from not only building permit if you're doing building, but also from the Conservation Commission. So part of that process requires permits being obtained and order conditions, which allows the work to proceed. But once that work gets completed, you need to obtain a certificate of compliance to close out the process. So what ends up happening is the teeth of the regulations essentially puts encumbrance on the deed as a way of making sure that the work gets completed. So the process requires a filing what's called a notice of intent, which is exactly what it means. You notify the Conservation Commission of work that's being done, and then again, the teeth in the regulations is if the order conditions get issued as part of that permit, and then it gets recorded at the registry, and so that goes on your deed physically. So and it stays there. It stays there until it gets.
And typically, this issue comes up as a seller's attorney. I'll get a call. I mean, ideally, it's a few weeks before closing. More likely, it's a few days before closing. And the buyer's attorney will say, hey, I got my title back. You know, you've got a mortgage payoff, and oh, there's an open order of conditions from 1983. And that's where you come in.
Yeah, right. And then a lot happens between
so
that.
The closing won't happen without the certificate.
But sometimes if it's a state order condition, that can take sometimes months.
Yeah, it's
And a lot of doing so.
Right.
We worked on one recently where there was someone put in a catwalk, and it was all done, and we were getting ready to close, and the catwalk hadn't been signed off on by the state, and so money was held in escrow for close to 2 years until that was resolved. The other thing that can happen is if you do live within an environmentally sensitive area and you've cheated and gone a little beyond as far as like maybe a patio or something like that, oftentimes that can come up. If an attorney goes to start looking for information, well, the plan says this.
Yeah, we had one situation where over 12 extra bricks that were over the line, and it caused quite a stir for a while. So.
Yeah, so it's not that, as pricing in housing continues to go up, real estate values, the consumer is far more smart, they're far smarter, and they're far more educated, and they're far less apt to take on risks because they don't really have to. They want this to be a smooth transaction, and I know I use this example all the time. It's like if you're going out clothes shopping or just shopping in general, and all of a sudden you get to the line and there's this long line in front of you, like, do I really need all this stuff? And you either put it all back or you walk away. The same holds true with real estate of all different price points. We've had deals fall apart just because the buyer's like, it's too much for me. I don't need this, I don't want all this stress. So our job is, and that's why we're having this talk today, is to kind of, alleviate some of the stress or help prepare you so that there are less speed bumps along the way.
If I can add to that, though, it isn't all about the buyer, and it isn't that the buyer completely controls your transaction. Massachusetts is still a buyer beware jurisdiction, caveat emptor, and I know we all have our own ideas as to what that means. In residential real estate, it means that a buyer needs to ask the question. You're not in a position where you're obligated to start disclosing all of this, but it's smart for you prior to listing or once your home is listed to get on it, because John's going to need a lot of time to get that certificate if it needs to be signed off by the state or even locally. There's
Well, a lot of
at least.
a lot of times they may require an as-built plan, for instance, or in Tony's example, if things were done differently than was on the plans originally, then it's not in compliance. So that means now you got to go back to the Conservation Commission. You have to reopen the file and then go before the board as well. They're going to review it, and depending on what the extent of the work was, if it's a great deal different than before, they may not approve it. They may have you take it out and restore it. So, that's where headaches come in for any of that process. So, And then it's not only that on the order conditions, there might be Board of Health restrictions on there. Another thing that we're finding out is anyone who's buying on the waterfront, and they may have a dock or a pier or shore protection or revetment or something like that, and it's in wetland regulation jurisdiction. It's not only the wetland conservation permit that you need, you also need a Chapter 91 license from the state. And a lot of those have kind of fallen by the wayside. They don't necessarily get the follow-through that's required. Because often what happens is someone develops a project and they get such a headache to get through, they get all the permits in place, and then it becomes out of sight, out of mind. You get the permit, it gets recorded, the work gets done, and then this might be a year or two later from the time you actually get the approvals and they actually do the work, and then it's done, and then you forget about it, and then it sits there, and then like you were saying, Karen, it goes back 20 years, 30 years sometimes, and it doesn't really rear its ugly head until you're ready to make a real estate transaction, or even if you're just looking to do some kind of title transfer. It could be title transfer within your own estate, right? If you're looking to make a title transfer from you to maybe your children, you change your title, maybe sometimes you might create an estate or something like that, a trust of some sort, that all goes through that, and you're going to have a title attorney who's going to review that, and if they're doing their job, it's going to get flagged up on it. So that case, it may not be as stressful because it's an internal, but if you're doing an outright sale in there, and in the process, it will delay that process.
And some banks won't, some banks will, but some banks won't allow an escrow so that the closing won't happen without it. So if it's if you're dealing with your local conservation commission, maybe it can happen with an extension of the purchase and sale of your closing date. If it's a Chapter 91, and I think most of us who do what I do, is when we're reviewing a title and we see a 91 license, we're all over it because of what John said. And those processes take so long and there's so many sign-offs. And I had one recently in Mashpee where it was from 94, and we picked this up, and it took 2 years to sign off. And one of the problems was that the regulations had changed. It was for a dock, and they held the dock to today's standard as opposed to the standard in 94. So it was very expensive. So just even if you don't sell, just looking at and making sure those types of things are taken care of on your property is smart.
And again, you'll get all of our information. There's a lot of great resources that you can go check some more of these things out because it's important. But before we get to the insurance component part, we wanted to talk a little bit about staging and painting and small things that make a big difference. Because again, you've lived in your house presumably for a long time. It's like, where do I start? And a lot of times, it's as easy as calling up. We've got some people that all they do is take, excess stuff away. You've got boxes and bags and collections and things that you don't want anymore. A lot of times it's easier just to start there with that and getting your house organized.
There's a lot of different layers to that too. There's a lot of great organizations now like Restore, which works for Habitat for Humanity. We have a seller right now who had collected a lot of oversized, bulky furniture in a very small house, and it was all beautiful stuff. But you walked into the house and that's all you saw was furniture, and it wasn't stuff she needed. And so she contacted Restore, and they came and welcomely took it away. If you don't know what that company is, what they sell then in their store, the money goes for Habitat for Humanity. So there's a lot of there's junk, there's garbage, and there's valuable stuff, and there's estate companies. There's lots of different ways to go about decluttering your space or minimizing the things that you have. And again, as Tony mentioned a while ago, sort of allowing people when they walk into your home to see the home and not your stuff that's in the home, and that's really what the goal is.
And sometimes just a fresh coat of paint throughout the house makes all the difference in the world, because again, people walk in and they can kind of still smell the fresh paint, everything looks clean and fresh, and neutral colors, gray is the new white, every shade of gray. It's amazing how much gray is being used, but it's pretty and it's relevant. Back in the 70s, it was goldenrod and avocado. Someday someone will look back and say, what were they thinking with all that gray they were using? They must have all been depressed. But
those are cheap fixes too. We had a house in Harwich that was beautiful, but it had been scuffed in every room, and it looked tired, and it wasn't tired. And for little money, we had one of our painters come through and just freshen up a couple rooms for $150, $200. He was able to freshly paint a couple rooms, and it changed the entire look of the home. And within a week or two, we had, an offer on the house, and it's amazing what you don't notice in your own home that
Right.
that buyers will when they walk in.
When I used to run this place, I used to marvel at, I'd walk into a room and there'd be a broken lamp or a broken window or something, and I'd say, why isn't the housekeeper, reported this? And when talking to her, she's like, well, I reported it to the maintenance department day 1, I did day 2. She said by day 4, I decided that's the way you wanted it, so I just kind of left it that way. And the point of that is that you get used to things after a while. And so having your house, making sure that the curb appeal is there, whether it's painting the door freshly or having the windows clean. Again, paint is a big thing. If you've got old stained carpet, either have it cleaned or get something inexpensive. A lot of this stuff is very inexpensively done. And there's a gamut of what you can do. I mean, the very first house I sold had been on the market for 4 years as a tear down. And these people called me and asked me to take a look at it. And I said, it's not a tear down, but if you're willing to spend some money, it was a $2.5 million house. And I said, if you're willing to spend the $15,000 to do these things, and I'll help you do it with the workers that we have, I think it'll make a difference. And they did the work. It took a couple months. And the house went under agreement in 9 days and sold for 95% of the asking price after being on the market for several years as a tear down, and people didn't tear it down. So a lot of times it's painting the vision for someone, because people today don't have the vision.
We did.
All us old timers, I'll speak to most of them. But there was a time when you could say, I could see this or I could see that. That's a lot of what we do. We're like, oh, you can do this will be easy. And so we try to make it easy for people. So again, fresh coats of paint, little things like that make all the difference. You want to show the spaciousness of your house and all the things that you first fell in love with your house. And when, in our listings, a lot of times we'll ask sellers, what do they love most about their house? Because typically that will be what the next person is going to love most about the house too. So
Before we have the gentlemen speak, Joe and John are going to speak, I really did mean earlier that we wanted this to be an open forum.
Yeah,
So if you guys have any questions at this
That's
point,
all
or
right.
if there's anything you want to ask, please feel free.
jump in.
Oh, okay.
Enough cookies back there, please.
Beside the docks and the waterfront stuff,
Yeah.
what else requires a state permit?
Well, I mean, there could be a superseding order conditions if for some reason there was some controversy with the local order conditions that got appealed, for instance, and it went back to the state level, then the state would issue a superseding order conditions. So that might be another state permit. There's also state environmental restrictions, restriction maps and things like that that would come into play on the property. Yeah, but not typically. Most of the way Massachusetts environmental regulations are set up, it's really technically a simultaneous filing. When you file with the, let's say, the wetlands order conditions, a copy, you file with the application with the local conservation commission, but it's a simultaneous application with DEP. They actually issue the file number, and it gets recorded on the property, but the enforcement and the oversight and the regulation of it goes through the local entity. So one of the things that we say, so there's not a whole lot to answer your question in terms of state permits. The Chapter 91 is one that we're seeing now. They hadn't really, to be honest with you, been enforced very strongly. That's out Cape Cod, or folks kind of forgot about it. There's a lot of old properties that have had docks and piers and things like that just got put in without any kind of permit at all. Back a few years ago, the state actually had like an amnesty program to allow people to get their docks put in place. And believe it or not, a lot of people didn't take advantage of that. So they just think, well, we've been doing this all our lives, and my grandfather put this pier in, and it's been here all along, and it may not have been permitted in the first place. So that's certainly a big issue right there as far as state permit. And it's very, very difficult, to go back and to get these things straightened out after a while. The thing that we recommend to folks is if you're contemplating putting a property up up for sale, and, particularly if you're on the waterfront or you've got concerns or considerations being in one of the jurisdictions, to do your own due diligence, and to go through. You can certainly do it yourself, or you can hire someone like Sharon or myself just to go through there. And it's not that expensive, just to look under the hood, so to speak, and to go through and do some research and to see what you have on record. It's a registry research, essentially, to see what's on file, and then get it cleaned up. And so you have to obviously go in, dig out whatever's on file, pull copies of the orders. Those were all recorded, they're all on file. And then, you have to diligently go through what's in the orders and then, do an on-site and then request a certificate. So it may be, a pretty painless process. I always tell people there's only one thing worse than bad news, and that's not knowing about it. So the sooner you find out about it, then you can deal with it, even before you maybe put it on the market.
And again, it goes back to if it will get found out about at some point, either by way of a title search or even the buyer's due diligence. It's amazing what buyers come to us today online, from what they find out online about neighborhoods, what's sold recently, what dynamics are going on in a community. It's all out
There are
there.
no
So
secrets anymore. Everything's out there.
it's really, before we used to hold all the cards. Now they come to us and say, we want to see these six houses in the back too. That's why it's important to have your house, beautifully photographed and show in its best light, because even before a buyer gets to us, they're online, because 95% of, whether, again, 200,000, 20 million, they're online looking and seeing, and if the picture and the story we tell doesn't compel them, they'll move to the next one. Yes.
How do you handle staging? Do you have one or two companies that you work with?
We
or-
do. In fact, one was going to be here, and her child got sick. Jacqueline Zartarian from Bungalow in Chatham. So there's a couple different levels, just like with all of this stuff, there's different levels. Sharon and I help with staging all the time. Sometimes we'll come in and say, let's get rid of some of this. We have a painter, why don't you paint that? And go to Marshall's and get a few throw pillows and call it a day and some new bedspreads. Sometimes it's as easy as that. Stagers will come in if it's more, if we feel like, you really need to add some furniture. We're good at taking things away and saying, let's repurpose this somewhere else. So
It's different depending upon our.
each place is different, but we have in helping people with staging as part of what we do. Is we have what we consider a concierge style service, so that again it's one-stop shopping. If you have empty rooms that need to be staged, then we bring in other stagers that would work, that are local.
The job is too big for us. We have people that we work with.
That
if
we
that's
work
what we
with.
work
Well,
with.
yeah, we have great
Yeah.
handymen, and get back to Dave. Dave and I he brought me over to a house recently in Yarmouth. Dave, why don't you talk about that one? Because that was a great one. The woman was thinking of selling.
Yeah, it kind of ties into the whole panel. So this client and investor were looking at their investment properties, and they wanted to buy an investment property near the water and then rent that out during the season, which is very busy here on the Cape and very profitable. However, they really didn't hire the appropriate professionals up front to find out the story of that house. And I always tell people, every house has a story. And if you're a seller, you really hold that story, and an aggressive buyer may want to know that story prior to making any offer. So it is always important to do your due diligence to know your own story in that negotiation process. But this potential client wanted to just replace windows, paint, and then put it on the market for a rental. So I went to the town, opened up that folder, and began to find that the health department would not sign off on a building permit unless the septic system was done. They had an old septic system, and unfortunately this property was in the A1 flood zone, and so now the septic system, which is traditionally $20,000, is now $40,000 as a raised septic. So, again, unfortunately, that investment turned into spending a lot more money up front just to do some of the very simple things in their mind, which were home improvement things. So the town, again, restricted them from pulling any type of permit, which means replace an electrical switch, replace a window, do anything to that home until that septic system was brought up to snuff, which was again like $40,000. Of course, now we're in over there to find that in order to replace the windows, the framer who built the house in the 1950s cut every corner, and everything was done a little Mickey Mouse. All the structural components were not done to code. And so that kind of, again, brings up another point. There's building codes that are in place to protect the homeowner and the contractor for all of these people today that, you know, don't have licenses, and they go and take deposits and don't show up or do shoddy work. There's a whole bunch of regulations within the state building code that want to protect you as a homeowner to hire the right tradespeople that would electrically wire a house correctly to code, so you don't have any problems with that. And in this one case, we had to basically structurally reframe the whole back of the house just to fit out new sliders for this. So this house is really, you know, on the exterior surface seemed like a great investment, but they didn't do their due diligence of opening that folder and kind of diving in. And unfortunately, they're into it for a lot more money.
And the thing is that having a guy like Dave, or even a home inspector, or somebody that you know, take a walk through and say, you know, you might want to fix that, or you might want to do that, or gee, I haven't had my chimney looked at in several years, I should probably get it swept and make sure that it's, you know, doesn't need repointing, or whatever the case may be. And then septic systems. I mean, 90% of us on the Cape deal with you know, Title V septic systems. So Sharon and I always recommend, even before listing or concurrently with listing, to have your septic system inspected. It's good for 2 years. And it's different than if you have it pumped every couple of years. That's a really good thing, just because it's a good thing to do. But the inspection is a sign off that has to be done before the house can be transferred to a new.
When I first started this business, it was very common for people to wait until they had an offer to test their system, and that's just what people wanted to do. I'm not going to bother until I get an offer. Why go through the trouble? But what we found, unfortunately, was that sometimes you would wait until you have an offer, and then you'd have it tested, and then there was a problem. And then you have to hope that the buyer is patient, and the seller and the buyer can work together to resolve the issue and keep the deal together. And so it's just one more hurdle to tackle. As Tony said, the inspection is good for 2 years. Obviously,
And
the
buyers are
expectation would
interested
be
right
to
up, buyers are interested right up front too, that his is a septic.
yeah, all of a sudden they're asking that ahead of time, you know, when they first walk in the door, you know, how's the septic, has it been tested yet? And they never used to ask that before, so.
Your septic report's actually good for 3 years if you pump it within the anniversary of the Title V being done.
Right.
So then you have proof of that, you attach that to the report, you get 3 years out of that report.
Okay.
So doing it now, even if you're not quite ready, isn't that?
Right, it's just an important thing.
How much does the inspection generally earn? A few hundred?
It's $375 to $400, and then there's a filing fee of $50.
The town charges about $50.
Yeah.
Each town is slightly different, but Harwich, Chatham are roughly
Figure
$50.
$500.
Yeah.
And we use, I mean, there's a lot of great companies. We use Speakman because they, again, come out any time of the day or night. They're really great. They are, and if there are small issues, they bring them right up and get them dealt with quickly.
Yeah, Speakman's really good actually about, and I don't mean to sound like I'm plugging them, but they really are great if they don't necessarily say the entire system has to be replaced. If they can figure out a way to just replace a piece of the system and still have it meet code, then they'll do that. I mean, they're not interested in causing problems for anybody, and they're really fantastic with that, so.
Yeah, it's a great collaborative effort, like the septic system.
And I would just add to that, the building inspection or home inspection company, relatively inexpensive. I'd say anywhere from $300 to $600, and you'll get a full report and they'll identify every problematic area. In fact, when I was out purchasing my property, I paid the $500 to $600, even though I'm in the trades, and I've used that as a scope of work document. I said, okay, I got insulation issues in this room, or I have a cracked one, and I just use that to execute and kind of work over a span of time to work through these little projects. But relatively inexpensive to have a
And it
professional
can
come
make
in.
you, it can give you a punch list of things you want to do, so that when the people come, when the house is ready for market, they're, it's kind of done, it's like, they're not going to find that, and
Well, I mean, if you really want to be proactive about it, we actually had a seller within the past year do their own, it's the first time that's happened for me, want to do their own home inspection report to see if anything would come up, which I thought was fantastic. It didn't even occur to me that that was something that I would recommend to sellers, but what a great tool to not only know what you have in store for yourself, but then you have time to fix it if you want to, and/or you can be proactive with any potential buyer if you want. I mean, you own the report if you wanted to share it with anybody and say, here you go, cards are on the table. You're welcome to pay for your own inspection, but I would love to share with you what I was able to uncover. I mean, anything that you can do now to sort of set yourself apart from other sellers or be ahead of the game, I think is really beneficial to you as the seller of your house.
and simply because it really, at the end of the day, it will yield you more money for your house.
But if I could point out too, this is discretionary. This is, again,
Yeah.
this is you do your due diligence, getting your information. Maybe that fireplace or the chimney needs to be repointed, and you don't want to do it. So you don't do it. You disclose it, that
Yeah.
it's something. It's going to be a factor in the pricing.
In the pricing,
That's
and
where
you just
need
reflect the
to-
price.
We have that too.
You may
But then you don't have to do it.
look at the report and say, you know what, we're not going to deal with any of this, but we're going to price it appropriately so the next person does.
And you're going to disclose that you already know
Know that
that
that's-
this needs to be done, that needs to be
Right.
done.
And it
But
goes,
you don't necessarily have
have to do either, yeah, any of this stuff is like, not have
Because
to.
again,
it's-
going back to caveat emptor,
Yeah.
you can keep your mouth closed until the buyer asks you a specific question, and then you have to answer it honestly and completely, but you don't have to put your cards on the table.
Are there required disclosure forms to fill out?
Not
So
required.
that's where I would probably be distinguished from your realtors, because if I'm representing a seller, I don't want you filling out a seller disclosure. And if I'm representing a buyer, I'm all over the seller for a seller's disclosure. So by law, you do not have to fill one out. I have a real problem with the form because it doesn't allow you to customize, and it almost creates issues when a buyer goes through it, like, why did it answer this, or what does that mean? So my advice,
We-
sorry,
we don't
my
have-
advice would be don't,
Yeah.
even if the
Tony
realtor
and I
says
don't
they
ever- it's not required.
Does the federal government still require this on
No,
mortgages? Does the state require it?
No.
No, we're a non-disclosure state.
So
we don't
nothing's
have-
required.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
Most agents that I
The
work
only
with
thing you
don't
have to
require them.
disclose, there are things, if someone asks you something specific,
absolutely
like,
have to answer it.
did you have water in your basement? You have to disclose it. If they don't ask and you have water in your basement, we don't have to disclose that. That's,
And once it's closed, it's closed. So that's, that's the other idea about the time frame. Get it closed, because there's no warranties from a seller to a buyer post-closing unless that's something that's been specifically negotiated, which is very rare that something like that happens.
there's a few items we would by law have to disclose. There was an illegal, drug dealing bust at the house, or if someone were murdered or raped or suicide or something like that.
Paranormal.
If someone died by natural causes, we don't have to disclose that. But those are probably the 4 or 5 things. Other than that, you don't have to disclose anything else. And so we rarely, if someone gives us a disclosure form, if a buyer does, we give it to the seller and say, you don't have to fill it out, they got the home inspection. That should be enough for them to deal with. I'm going to have Joe get up and talk a little bit about the insurance component.
Sure.
Because that's a really important thing.
So when it comes to, and Ryan, I don't know how many, so Ryan is really our kind of homeowner specialist, and I talk a lot more about the flood insurance and those pieces. So Ryan, I don't know how many of these are yours, but go ahead.
The big one I want to touch on, which kind of ties into everything that's been said in the last 2 minutes actually, is what we call ordinance and law coverage. I was kind of thinking of different topics that aren't on the forefront of people's heads when it comes to insurance. So think of it this way, when you buy a homeowner's insurance policy, it's basically a contract between the consumer and the insurance company. And the homeowner's policy, when you buy it, it replaces it to the way it was at the time of loss. Does not necessarily take into consideration the change of building codes. We've heard it around the tables a few times so far. Particularly back in 2008, we had a pretty big building code change here in Massachusetts. And with that change, say your house had burnt down at that point in time. You were your home was in a flood zone, or you were on the coast in a particular town that made you put in at that point in time, the new hurricane-proof windows, special strapping. If it was in a flood zone, maybe you had to put it up on piers if it burnt down. The basic homeowner's policy will only replace it to the way it was at the time of loss. It does not necessarily take into consideration these changes in building codes. So you could have a house that, yeah, it would have cost $400,000 to rebuild it, but with these new building code changes that went through, you could have seen an increase in 25–30% of the building costs just based upon that. And the basic policy only gives 10% of the dwelling limit. So for easy math, if you just use today a $500,000 house, you only have $50,000 to pay for those changes. Whereas Dave can say that when this happened in 2008, your regular Anderson 400 series window that was $500 is now $1,200, $1,300. The cost of framing is higher now because they have to tie the bottom plate to this to that. So people don't realize that that's a factor when it comes to homeowners insurance, particularly with the way like they even changed the flood zone maps in 2014 here on the Cape. A lot of us that weren't necessarily in a flood zone before now became in, our homes were put into a flood zone. And those people particularly could see extraordinary building costs if something did happen. Not even if it just flooded, but if the house burnt to the ground or had something happen, you'd then have to adhere to the new codes and could drastically see an increase in the cost of construction, whereas the homeowner's policy would only provide X, but you really needed Y to complete the whole project. So people don't necessarily understand that or realize that it is an issue, but unless your policy, you see a higher coverage for ordinance and law, you're only going to get probably the 10% of your building coverage, which could be insufficient if you did have to rebuild your home.
And as far as, and John, this is where you come in a bit too, on elevation certificates, can you talk a little bit about that and how important that is? I don't know how many of you close to water, near water, you don't know if you're in a flood zone or not. Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
But I mean, I tried to stress that a lot lately. The code changed again this year, the first of the year. They've kind of come back a little bit on it. It's not as strict as it was because they estimated the wrong wind-borne areas and the different speeds that they used before has now lessened a little bit, so they have come back a little bit on those regulations. But at the end of the day, it still could be a lot of out-of-pocket expense that people don't realize. Did they change it in most towns on the Cape in the after the first of the year again?
Yeah, there is a new building
The state
code.
building code covers all the jurisdictions.
Right.
State was issued.
And then another thing people don't realize on our homeowners policy is, let's take the past 3 weeks that we've had. It's been 0 to 90-mile-an-hour winds basically for the last 3 weeks. A lot of times people don't realize, so say you have your house, again, we'll use the 500,000 mark, and you have a homeowner's policy that has a 2% wind deductible. You have wind damage at your house, the insurance company's not going to respond until it gets greater than $10,000. Because that 2% is of the dwelling limit. A lot of times people say it's 2% of the loss or something like that. No, it's of that face value of the policy for the dwelling. So your $500,000 house, you have $15,000 in damage from the wind, you could be responsible for the first $10,000. Different companies have different deductibles. It could come as a straight wind deductible, meaning any wind whatsoever. It could be hurricane specific, so it has to be a category 1 or greater hurricane. I mean, there's a whole insurance nerdy thing I could go into. But if we get a hurricane that hits land in Massachusetts and your policy has a hurricane deductible, you could be responsible for that. The third part is what they call a named storm deductible. I jump on this one lately because don't listen to the media. What was it the other day? Tobey was the last one.
I was going to say, how do you distinguish, because the Weather Channel now names everything.
We got Tobey, all these names. That means nothing when it comes to this. The deductible the name has to come from National Hurricane Center or NOAA or somebody like that, not a media source. So if the past few weeks, each one of them has had a new foolish name to it. If you did have a policy and you did have damage at your house, the name storm deductible would not apply because the National Weather Service did not come up with that. Somebody from the Weather Channel did. People don't realize that they have these on their homes, particularly remember we'll say 10, 15 years ago, it seemed like Florida got hit every other week in the month of August, like Hurricane Andrew, etc. You went down 2 years later, people still had tarps on their roofs because they didn't realize that they had a $10,000 deductible. They didn't have the money to pay for the damage before the insurance company would cover the rest of it. So a lot of times people don't realize that they have it and really look at what you have and what you do buy if you go to buy another home to make sure that you know what you're buying and you don't have any unforeseen out-of-pocket expenses. At Rogers and Gray, like I said before, we've got 9 offices and we have a pretty big department, what we call our high net worth department. It's basically homes that have a dwelling rebuild cost of $1 million. These days, depending upon the builder, the quality and everything of the home, you could spend $1 million building a 2,000 square foot house. It all depends on what kind of materials you want. And not necessarily all carriers can cater to that. So there's been more niche markets of pure insurance, AIG, private client group, Chubb, etc. that cater to this market and they know how to deal with the higher end builders compared to traditional homeowner. So a lot of those carriers can also do out-of-box coverages. They can manuscript policies, meaning they can change coverages around. It's not necessarily just by the book. So it's a good thing to look into. And then another thing we always try to stress around is keeping everything in one place. So a lot of times people say, all right, I'm going to call 5 insurance agents, get 5 different quotes. And particularly myself, Joe, and a couple other people, we've spent a lot of time working with the flood insurance market, particularly when everything hit the fan in 2014 around here. Not all insurance agencies you talk to will know the rules and the regulations and may rate it incorrectly. I had one recently that they had an agent out of Rhode Island. When the maps changed in 2014, they bought a policy. Well, that agent didn't realize that they could have gotten like a preferred risk policy extension policy or newly mapped rate policy. They were paying it started out about $4,500 and over 3 years it's up to about $5,500 that they were paying. Well, they only had to be paying $800 to start in the first place. So the agent that did the work didn't realize the other rules behind it all and wrote it that way. I was able to get the guy back $15,000 over those years that he overpaid, but it was a lot of work to do it. So make sure, that's why I said when you're talking to an agent, keeping it all in one place, also make sure the agent knows what they're doing.
Because that goes back to, again, we're very big on using local professionals because each town, each village has very different nuances. What goes on in Orleans doesn't necessarily go on in Harwich and so on and so forth. So that's why these guys.
And you don't want a flood policy with agent A, homeowners with agent B. God forbid this loss does happen, nobody knows what to talk to each other. So having it all in one place makes it a lot easier, particularly like then if you have an umbrella policy, that way if there's a liability claim, you're only dealing with one agent and it makes life a lot easier for everybody.
All right, so this is where I come in. I put a lot of slides in here that talk about, a lot about the flood insurance program and what to do if you have a policy or if you're looking to buy a home that could potentially have a flood policy on it. I'm going to change my discussion just a little bit. And I want to start off with a kind of a gauging question is how many people in this room right now are required to have flood insurance because of their mortgage? Okay, that's a good baseline. So that simplifies my part a little bit. What I do want to bring up, though, is something very important when it does come to the requirement to or the requirement not to have flood insurance, because there's really 2 pieces that go on in the world of flood insurance. There's the requirement to have flood. We call that mandatory purchase. started in 1973, strengthened in 1994, and then strengthened again in 2012. And what this means is if you have a federally backed mortgage with a federally regulated lender, then you're required to have flood insurance in a high-risk flood zone. So everybody in this room either doesn't have a federally backed mortgage or isn't in a high-risk flood zone. That doesn't mean that you're off the hook, because as we saw this past August and September, just because you're not required to carry flood for various reasons doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a flood insurance policy. And whether your house is worth $2 million or $100,000, starting with the National Flood Insurance Program to purchase a flood insurance policy is not only critical, it's also fairly inexpensive for everybody in this room that clearly doesn't have the requirement to carry flood insurance, which most likely means you're not in a high-risk flood zone. If you're not in a high-risk flood zone, then you can get a flood insurance policy for at most $500 for a primary resident and add $250 onto that for a second home. So you're really looking at a fairly expensive policy that'll protect you up to $250,000 in the event of a flood. You know, what I like to tell people is even if your property is, you know, it would cost $250,000 to replace a door on your building, it's still worth having the policy. Why? Because there are things that are covered within that policy that you may never have thought that you could ever put a flood insurance claim in for, right? So what happens if water comes around your building but never comes inside? Should you file a claim? Well, why don't have the adjuster come out, because they're paying for the cleaning of your foundation walls. So wouldn't you want the mold and mildew cleaned off of your foundation after a flood? You probably do. So have an adjuster come out and take a look, because that's a covered loss under the flood program. What happens when you have a basement and you have a few inches of water down there and it doesn't seem like a big deal? Well, we talked about mold and mildew earlier. The flood insurance program will pay to have mold and mildew remediated before it grows. So you should probably have an adjuster come to look at the problem. Now, if you have seepage in your basement, whether it's from or your interior space, whether that's from a septic or from groundwater rising, it's not covered under a flood policy unless the direct cause is due to a flood. What happens if your street in front of your home floods? Maybe it comes on your property a little bit, but the direct cause of that flood is sewage backup. You have coverage under your flood policy. Probably didn't know that. What if the water comes off of the street, over your property, and then into your property somehow? That happened a lot this winter, not just because of the storms we had, but because of the immense amount of rainfall we had in some of these events. That's covered under the flood program.
And
So,
we had two astronomical rainstorms.
Exactly.
In August, like within
Yeah.
2
Yeah.
weeks.
You had 7 inches of rain.
7 inches of rain in a 24-hour period is the same as a mapped event on the FEMA flood maps. So if you have a 7-inch in 24 hours, and we had a much faster rate of rain than that, you have an event that would have superseded what is actually mapped for on the maps. Because it's not a 1 in 100 chance of a flood, it's a statistical 1% a year that that flood could happen. So what we're seeing is, we've seen statistically, astronomical rainfalls. We're seeing storm events this past winter that certainly were 1% chance for flooding in a year in places that just you would never suspect to see water. Now, I personally have the mindset of everybody's in a flood zone. It just matters whether you're in a high-risk zone or a low-risk zone. So purchasing that flood insurance policy for what could be $500 could really change your situation when it comes to having an event. We had a situation at Rogers and Gray where we had a large commercial client in one of those astronomical rain events that had runoff from a large field come onto his commercial property, and it flooded his work garage. Materials inside and damage to the building was in excess of $50,000, and it was 100% uninsured. 100%. He's not in a high-risk zone. Commercial flood policies are a little different. Probably would have costed him, though, $1,200 a year to get coverage on that garage, which would have also covered the stock inside of it. Had no coverage. And that material was damaged, the building was damaged, and that's $50,000 that he didn't expect to lose. And he's on a hill in the middle of a wooded area on the Cape, but it was that field of sheet flow water that came into his property, and then the drain clogged, and the water had nowhere to go. So that is, so I have that discussion with you because we could go through my slides and talk a lot about the flood program, but where the rubber meets the road, for everybody in this room, it seems anyways, is to have the value and understanding what the flood policy can do, because it covers things you wouldn't think. And if everyone in this room is truly not in a high-risk flood zone, it's valuable to go out and purchase that low-rate policy, which gives you that $250,000 in coverage that'll cover the, sometimes it's the small things that count. I had one client that I was working with that had 2 inches of water in the basement. There's very limited coverage in the basement. The carpets weren't covered, the furniture wasn't covered. But then things started to add up. The water, come to find out, had gone around the back of the foundation. The 2 inches of water hadn't hit any utilities, which would have been covered in the basement, but it started seeping into the drywall that they had in the basement, started getting into the foundation walls. Before you know it, with only cleanup, and they'll replace up to 4 feet high of drywall. So the combination of the two ended up being a $30,000 claim for 2 inches of water in a basement. That's a lot of money for somebody that didn't realize there was that much damage going on with that little water. So it counts and it matters, and purchasing a national flood insurance policy is a really good idea. So.
Especially during, in a year when a lot of this stuff has happened and been a little unusual. I want to get back to the mold.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing to reiterate what they've been saying is, everybody says, I'm not in a flood zone. Well, Joe said, one of the mindset everybody is. And particularly that Friday night back in August, whatever it was, I know particularly right by my house, in Yarnport, there's like a town green over by this big church in Yarnport. Well, the road runs down and loops back around as you're heading up towards the old Hamilton and A couple of the older houses right there, the water came running down the road, blew out the foundations. Because you gotta consider it, a flood has to affect 2 parcels or greater. Parcel A could be the roadway, parcel B could be your house. Those people that lived in those houses, they've been here for 200 years, we aren't anywhere near the water, we don't have to worry about that. Well, when towns do their infrastructure and they do sewers or the drainage, etc., that's only based upon like a 3-inch storm at a 24-hour period or something like that, right, John? Whereas we could get 7 inches in a couple hours and the storm drains and everything can't keep up with that. So think of that as well, if you're down in the end of a cul-de-sac or anything along those lines.
The other thing that I wanted to kind of circle back around with, and there's information out there, is about the mold and mildew remediation, because in all basements you smell it. And as they were saying that these houses need to breathe, and there's some really, cement is porous, so water naturally attracts to it, and probably everybody in this room has a dehumidifier in their basement, which is helpful, but actually what it's doing is it's kind of continuing to draw the water into your house, and for very few dollars you can get, there's a fan system that just keeps moving the air around because it's all about airflow. And I think that's a really important piece to the whole moisture issue that we suffer with on the Cape, and that's just part of, it used to be part of the charm of the Cape, some people not so much anymore. And again, especially with going back to today's buyers, the young people that are so in tune to health and safety and wellness, and that's one of the things that we really strive for, is making sure that the products we're selling, are in compliance with health and safety issues and meet all the codes and regulatory stuff, because it's really important to make the transaction go as smoothly as possible, because it is a process, and there are speed bumps along the way in our jobs, Sharon and mine, and people like Karen and John and everybody at this table, is to help mitigate some of those speed bumps and make it so that you're getting the highest value for your house. And the true value of anybody's house comes down to this. It's what, at a given moment, a buyer is willing to pay and what a seller is willing to accept. And therein is the value of your house. And a lot of times people say, well, my neighbor's house is listed, or these people are asking $3 million for their house. And, well, people can ask whatever they want for a house. A true comp is when it's sold. Once it's sold, then it becomes, that's the value of that house for that person. And so then you can start making comparisons. But when you see a lot of houses that are asking different prices, that's great. And we use that as for competition reasons and say, well, in that price range, here's your competition, just so you understand. And as you continue to consider selling your house, go to open houses in areas that of prices, homes that are similar, you think are similarly priced, and see what they have to offer, see what they look like, see if you're, you think you're in the ballpark or not. And again, it's really a process. It's a far easier process with the right people behind you and working with you. There's certainly a lot of choice out there. There's a lot of great real estate agencies. There's a real Cape is blessed with having a lot of great realtors. We're blessed to be working with all properties, and we're very proud of that. We have offices in Boston and the Cape, so we do a lot of what we call cross-promoting or connecting the dots, because most of our buying pool comes from the Boston area. So, and that's a really important part. But at this point, I wanted to see if anybody out here has questions. You've been really nice, kind of quiet, but we'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are, or what questions you may have, because there's a lot to it. And a lot of this is technical stuff, we understand, but it's all good information to have.
The current septic tank regulation requirement is what?
Well, in most cases, it's Title V. There are still some...
And that was, Title V is several years old, wasn't it?
Well, it is, but it depends on, you could have a Title V system that's 30 years old, and if it passes and you hire a company like Speakman or Bobby Hour or whoever, and it passes, you're fine. It's a pass-fail system. Sometimes there's a conditional pass where there's work that needs to get done, whether a D-box needs to get replaced or something like that. In certain
There's
towns,
also marginal passing too, so
Yeah.
like which happened in my own house, so
Okay.
it was approaching a point at which there might need to be something done to it, but by law, by the pass-fail system, it technically passed, but they wanted to at least disclose to the buyer that it was sort of getting close. So that's a marginal passing system.
and there are still some
I was
towns...
gonna say 1995 was the last big Title V regulation change. So, most folks by now, if back in the old days, they had the cesspools.
Right.
It was mandatory that those had to be upgraded as part of the real estate transfer. If you got an older home and you still have a cesspool, then, that would be a mandatory thing. 95 was when the big Title V change. There's been some amendments to it, but that was the big change. A lot of times you look at the age of the installation, and that's one thing that the Board of Health will be taking a look at. A lot of it gets triggered also if there's any kind of improvements in the building.
Right.
When you go to pull a building permit, they're going to take a look at how old the septic system is. So kind of all those things factor into it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, even if your house has oil heat, things like that, find out from the town if your single wall tank will be acceptable in the transfer. You have to switch to a double wall. I mean, there could be a whole gamut of things that you'll need to
And
know.
there's actually different towns right now, even on the Lower Cape, are different with regard to that, so I think...
I think Chatham is double wall.
Chatham, it's not required yet, though, it's close, but...
Harwich is.
I think, no, so
East
we're not even sure.
Hampton is.
East Hampton is, I think Brewster is, but Harwich
Yeah.
isn't yet mandated, and I don't think Chatham is yet mandated.
Any other questions?
What is the Chapter 91 that you referred to?
So Chapter 91 license, John, go ahead. I can explain.
Yeah,
it, but
okay,
you'll
so
be
it's
better at it.
interesting little bit of Massachusetts history in particular. It goes back to the colonial law. Massachusetts and Maine actually are the only states in the United States that have ownership that go all the way up to mean low water. And the reason Maine, because Maine used to be part of Massachusetts. And if you really study your history, you know, that was part of the Missouri Compromise. There was slave states versus free states, and when Missouri became a state, part of the compromise to keep the balance of power between the North and the South was that they split Massachusetts into two, and Maine became a free state, and Missouri was allowed to come into the Union. So anyways, going back to the colonial law, when the properties were first deeded from the king, even before it was the United States, it was a colony of Great Britain, the ownership of the property went all the way up to mean low water, and it still does.
Low water?
Mean low water, yes. A lot, and some of those may have changed because of the way the properties were sold off, but technically speaking, the original deeds were written up to mean low water. So as we know, there's a huge tidal range, for instance, if you're on Cape Cod Bay side, so you know that amount of beachfront is quite large in some of the properties. So the jurisdictional lines essentially run between the high water mark and the low water mark. Anything beyond low water is in Commonwealth jurisdiction. That intertidal zone between high and low water, even though you own the property all the way out, there were certain rights of passage that the citizens of the Commonwealth had privileges over. And the colonial law was written such that those rights were limited to the purposes of fishing, fowling, and navigation. So if you had a fishing pole or a gun, if you were hunting or you were in a boat, you could traverse across private property. So as the Commonwealth developed in order to encourage interstate commerce, the Commonwealth allowed for construction of structures within that intertidal zone. So if you built a pier or a dock or a boat ramp or a marina, you're essentially obstructing potentially the interest of the Commonwealth to be able to traverse across those intertidal areas. So once you build a structure across that, the state would allow you to do that subject to certain requirements, which is a license. So you would have to obtain a license in order to construct the pier or the dock or whatever it is within those areas and obtain the license accordingly. And those licenses were typically for a certain period of time, and they would allow you to construct and maintain. So some of the older ones were essentially in perpetuity. They throttled that back down to 99-year licenses. The new licenses are limited to 30 years. So, you know, again, that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of some of these waterfront structures that were done, and they're into those intertidal zones. The interest of the Commonwealth had gotten more restrictive as time had gone by. So what you can do in those intertidal zones are more restricted. Towns have passed bylaws that prohibit construction of certain types of structures. So anyway, so Chapter 91 really kind of, it's a segment of legislation that allows or permits the certain types of construction within that intertidal zone.
Thank you.
Long answer to a short question.
But it is fascinating once you get into it.
I think if I'm understanding correctly, the waterfront we're talking about here is areas that are affected by the tides.
Correct.
Ocean, we wouldn't be talking about waterfront on like a freshwater pond.
Well, great ponds are included in this, you know, so there are defined.
Even one that's not affected in any way by tides.
Correct, yes.
Okay.
It could be within an inland jurisdiction as well.
Okay.
Like if you're on a pond. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Or an estuary.
And these become issues at closing because the licenses are recorded at the Registry of Deeds. So at that point in time, the buyer's attorney is going to review it to make sure that it is compliant and that it's been, actually there's a time frame in the licenses as to when you have to record it to make the license effective. And that's what I come across on more occasions than I'd like to admit, that the attorney who gets to the end point doesn't get it recorded at the Registry of Deeds within the 60-day time frame or the 90-day or whatever specified, records it 6 months later. Well, the fact that it wasn't recorded within the time frame makes it invalidates it. So you have to go through the whole process again.
I know we've laid out a lot of information today, and you know, it's one of those things, it's proper planning prevents panic type of a thing. And our goal and job is to keep you going. And I know there's a couple of other things. But
This one in particular.
Yes.
Well, I'll just touch on this really quick. If you do buy a flood policy and the maps change, I get the question all the time, are the maps going to change? Are the maps going to change? I don't know. FEMA's mapping budget is about $500 million per year, and if the current presidential appropriation goes through, that'll be cut to $150 million per year. And if that happens, the program will be mothballed to a maintenance program. So do I see the maps on Cape changing anytime soon? Absolutely not. I know the South Shore will be seeing a map change probably at the end of this year. That's the only New England or Massachusetts map change that I see coming. But needless to say, if you buy a flood policy, it can be transferred. We recommend it be transferred. If you're ever told it can't be transferred, that's not true. So just know that flood policies, and that's probably one of the biggest things too that we like to try to tell people is that policy can be assigned to a new owner. So when we're talking about sales of homes, that flood policy can be transferred.
And that's an important point because of the grandfathering provision that Joe's talking about. If you are in a flood zone, it's mandatory. If you're going to get a mortgage, whoever the seller or whoever the buyer is going to be, they want to pull a mortgage, the bank is going to require it. And they're quite stringent. And you may think that you're not in a flood zone, but the flood maps changed in 2014, so there were people that were previously not in a flood zone that are now in a flood zone, and it's a critical thing.
And how do you find out if you are on flood?
Well, that's what I was just going to say, is what's interesting about that is FEMA is under no obligation whatsoever to tell you whether you are in or out of a flood zone. They have no jurisdiction over doing any of that. The only way that you will find out, other than doing your own due diligence, or other than purchasing a voluntary flood policy because you're not required by your lender, is your lender. They're the only ones that are, as we mentioned, they're very regulated, those federally regulated lenders, and the ones that aren't federally regulated will probably sell their loan to a federally regulated lender, and so their interest is to make sure they're doing their due diligence anyways. So they are fined. And I'm actually doing a research project with JP Morgan right now on this very issue. For every loan that is required to have flood insurance, a lender can be fined $2,000 56 times during that loan. So do you think a lender wants a $110,000 penalty on your loan? No, they don't. And so they will do everything they possibly can to make sure you have that flood insurance if you're required to have it under the OCC and FDIC regulations. And
So what does somebody do if they don't have a mortgage, though?
if they don't have a mortgage, then their due diligence is going to be what triggers them to know whether they're in a high-risk zone or not. And that's when you come to someone like Rogers and Gray who can run a flood zone determination, which are third-party companies that actually identify on regulatory paper whether you're in a flood zone or not. See, looking at a flood map and deciding on your own that you're in or out of a flood zone is not how the world works, unfortunately, when it comes to flood insurance. From a lender's perspective, and you always want to try to do it the way the lender's going to do it in case that's the direction that the property goes someday, is they go to a third-party vendor, and those vendors pull an official determination on what's called a flood hazard determination form, and then that is what is decided on what flood zone you're in, and even those can conflict. The only one that matters is the lender, because that's what the lender's examiner is going to be pulling when they do their audits on an annual basis.
But if someone comes to you, you'll issue a certificate, they would have the certificate then.
We pull a flood zone determination just like a lender would pull.
So it would be something that Tony and Sharon would have as information.
Exactly. And we're actually now recommending, I haven't seen this done in my entire time in the flood program, but I've started to because of how many mistakes are made outside of the regulatory world. We're starting to recommend that homeowners and realtors go and pull their own flood zone determinations. Even though it's kind of a complicated form, it is truly a regulatory form. It's what the lenders use to make their decisions. And if there's a conflict between the form you pull and the form the lender pulls, the two companies that can actually talk to each other to resolve the problem. The only way you can have that happen is if you pull your own flood zone determination. So that's the way that we do
Is there a charge for that?
For us to do one, no, there isn't. No.
Okay.
And having flood makes your house sellable too. Like if you're in a flood zone, go buy a policy, because that buyer does not want to deal with this at the last minute.
Especially this year, what we're finding is people that were more inclined to want to be on the water are now like, water view is good enough. We want to be a little further away. It just, it goes in cycles. I mean, in a couple of years, if we stay relatively quiet on storm front, then, it'll settle down,
Getting that now too, it just plays right into the whole idea of your buyer wanting a turnkey, not
Turnkey,
going to
yeah.
deal with it.
Yeah.
So you've taken care of that.
These buyers don't, we've all been on the Cape presumably for a while, and you kind of know who to go to and what to do and things like that. And buyers come down and they're like, who do we call and how do we do this? And so our jobs really are to make it very easy for them, because we all know on the Cape too, it's very hard to get good quality vendors and things like that in a timely fashion. And so that's why it's really, really important. Sharon, I know you wanted to talk about...
I don't want to take short the door. You look.
Yeah, I'm pretty much all set. All I was going to mention is you can challenge those determinations through the lender, through the LOMA process if you want to, and that's an elevation certificate required process. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say is that determination essentially tells you that you're in or you're out.
Yeah.
But to actually know exactly to what level you are, you have to have an elevation certification done.
And how do you get that?
So what you have to have a surveyor or professional engineer actually physically.
You guys do them?
Yeah, we do those. There's a modest fee to it, but.
That is important. A lot of buyers want to see elevation certificates.
Yeah, the determination is you're in or you're out, so that's no cost thing. Then if you find out you're in, then you have the elevation certification. Then you know where you are, what level that you're at, and again, what level of risk that you might be in.
And the elevation certificate in some ways, so we all read the paper, see the news, oh my God, the sky's falling, I'm paying $5,000 a year, $6,000 a year just in flood insurance. There could be cases where the elevation certificate actually helps and could bring the premium down. So, and the best part of it is with the elevation certificate is now you're getting the actuarial rate. So you know what the ceiling would be based upon that. So if you had a home and it was in a bad flood zone and it was $5,000, you're negatively elevated, come to find out it really should be $7,000, $8,000, you could get a policy of $5,000, throw that out until you actually get to that benchmark, then use your elevation certificate to determine the pricing. So it's a big, big thing to have if you are in a special hazard flood zone.
And there are cases, if you may have land and property that partially is in a flood zone, but your house isn't in a flood zone, and then you're fine. You wouldn't necessarily need to get flood insurance if just say a portion of the land was.
Don't necessarily, if there's a bank involved, take the bank's word for it. Talk to an insurance person, because a lot of times what Joe mentioned a few minutes ago, there's different companies that do the determinations. The banks, a lot of times the banks ones are pretty conservative. They may catch, if it's just on the land, the bank may say, all right, it's in a flood zone. Well, if you actually looked at the map and did a different determination, it could be the structure outside of it, so it could not be required. I've seen that happen a lot.
And from the day that you go to apply for your loan and you say, hey, I'm interested at XYZ building, as part of the loan, every single loan that is made has a flood zone determination associated with it. Doesn't matter where it is. There's 27 million flood zone determinations done annually because there's one for just about every loan transaction that's done. But the lenders have a 60-day grace period where they give their vendors 60 days to get them that flood zone determination. That's a best practice. There's no set time frame. So that's why a lot of the times you'll hear, we found out, I had somebody call me about a month ago and it was the day before the closing and they had to get flood insurance. They literally found out the day before closing because the lender gave their vendor all that time to get back to them on where the building lied. In a flood zone, and they didn't do their own due diligence beforehand.
Sharon, I
Yeah,
know
so
you
I'll
want-
come back to you, John, in a second. Just really quickly, I know that I just attended a Harwich tour when they
This
had
has
a
been a hot
speaker from
topic.
National Grid come to talk to the agents, which we've all been dying to find out what is going on with this conversion or this moratorium. And, I'm sure you've all heard by now that there's been this moratorium with converting to natural gas. And so there was a wealth of knowledge that was provided to us, and I thought that it would be helpful to you as sellers and to translate to, potential buyers for your home. The current status of the project is that the issue is from Dennis to Eastham is what they're currently working on, the expansion of the main line that supplies all the gas. It's currently 1/5 completed. And they believe strongly, although they can't promise anything, that they will be finished with the project by what they're calling early 2019. So the end is in sight, and that's a good thing. And they're, I'm sure have been stuck in many a traffic zone because of the work that they're doing. So they're certainly working diligently to get the completion done. There are a couple of current exceptions, though, which I find fascinating, and I don't still really understand why they're excluding these from being issues, but you can still add, if you already have gas to your home, you can add a gas generator, and you can add a gas grill without any problems. I think the gas grill issue is because it's really about the demand for the gas, and so at the time that you're cooking on a grill outside is when nobody is heating their homes. And so the issue of the supply and the demand for the pipe is not a problem, so they don't have an issue with allowing people to hook up to a gas grill, so I think that's the
I think there was a lot of
explanation for that.
misinformation out there that you couldn't add things and things like that, so it's, again, it's more for you to know and for us to know from, if you're heated with oil, we can explain to people what the process is. A lot of new construction now is using propane with conversion, knowing that they're going to convert to natural gas in time, but there's...
So the other issue is that if you already have gas to your home, there was a misconception that you couldn't add another appliance. So a lot of people had gas heat, but they still had an electric stove. And the rumor was out that you couldn't convert to a gas stove because the moratorium was saying no more. That's not true. If your meter to your house can support the BTUs for that extra unit, and any plumber will be able to tell you that, you can add that appliance. So for some buyers that come to the table, they get upset because they think, well, there's no gas stove for cooking or something of that nature. You just have to ask a plumber if your meter can handle it, and so that's a misnomer,
Yeah, I
yes.
even got a pool heater.
I have a gas generator, and I inquired about getting a gas furnace, and they said no.
Well, that could be because of the meter that you have. I mean, converting to a whole new system is what the moratorium is about. Having a generator alone, I think, is not enough BTUs to have an issue, but it would require a whole new meter to do that, and they're not swapping meters out right now at all. There's currently a waiting list, though, being sort of collected by this woman, Ellen Whelan. So if you want to do this conversion in your future, or if you want to put your house on a list for when the moratorium gets lifted, you can contact Ellen Whelan and get your house, your service on the list, because they are starting that. So the last thing you want to do, I think, is wait until the moratorium is lifted to do that, because then you're going to be far behind the eight ball at that point.
Is it assignable?
I'm sorry?
Is it assignable? So if I put my house on the list and then I sell my house,
That's
my
a really
buyer
good question.
step in?
I'm not sure about
So that's
that.
just something, if you call to do it, that's just something to ask.
And then there's also, I don't know if any of you have larger homes that already have gas generators or use a lot of BTUs, but I guess the old installation was done with half-inch piping, and now they're even recommending that be converted to a 1-inch pipe for the supply issue to the house. And so National Grid will come out and do that for you for, I think it's a $1,200 fee to do the main line to your house conversion from half-inch to 1-inch to make sure that you have enough to supply from into your house. So there's a lot of information out there and a lot of misinformation out there, and I wanted to at least provide you with contact names and phone numbers so that you could, inquire for yourself. But it's not as dire as we have been, hearing about, and there is an end in our near future. So that's all I just wanted to say.
A couple last points before we wrap up, and if there's any questions, a lot of times people ask us, when is the best time to list your house? Like, when, is there a certain season, is there a certain time? And the real answer is, any time of the year is a good time of the year to list your house, as long as it's, priced well, in good condition and great, and the location goes back to price, condition, location. There's a misconception that the winter time is not a good time to put your house on the market. It actually is one of the better times to put your house on the market because inventory is low, so there's less competition. Springtime, more houses come on the market, but that's usually when the buyers come out. I'll tell you that 60% of the real estate transactions happen in the second half of the year on the Cape. So really the fall selling season is a very big time of the year for people. The summer traditionally is a little quieter because people are on vacation. They are, more apt to be worrying about being on the beach than looking at a home. By September, they're starting to think about, oh, we need to get a home, for next year or something like that. So don't ever think there's a wrong time of the year. There really isn't. Buyers are out there. We've actually had a pretty busy winter in spite of the bad weather. So,
Don, I feel like we cut you off.
Yeah, we talked about most of kind of what I want to touch upon, just if I could summarize. I think, again, you're talking about like this seller's due diligence. If someone's going to buy the house, they're going to be doing their due diligence, get the home inspection report and so forth. So one of the things that we advise is to do your own due diligence. So, you could hire a home inspector. Again, that's really just your information. You could look at your flood insurance piece of it, do the determination to see who you are, research your deed registry and all that sort of thing to see if there's any outstanding permits. If any work has been done on the building, go down to the building department, pull permits, see what's on record, make sure they've all been closed out. You got certificates of occupancy on any of the work that was done, certificate of compliances on any of the environmental permits that have been done. The other thing that we really urge our people in terms of Title V is to maintain records. So if you have it pumped and you pump it regular, keep an owner's manual, if you will. And that's not only for your septic system, any kind of infrastructure that you might have. If you're on private water, for instance, do you have it tested? Keep track of those test records. You have any kind of equipment that's put in, solar panels are real popular these days. Warranties that go along with any of the installations, mechanical systems, air conditioning, heating, boilers, that sort of thing. Keep track of all those records. So think about that. If you're buying a property or a home, or you buy a car, you get an owner's manual. So you think about, if you're a buyer and you're looking at property and you see the seller has kept records of all the maintenance, they've got, everything's in a binder, for instance, and, here's all the warranties on all these installations that we have on there. That gives them a better feel for, all right, well, this person's really taking care of their home, and I'm less likely to find, that there's hidden traps or someplace along the line. If you have if you're on the waterfront, you have a homeowner, maybe go through a homeowner inspection. It's probably not a bad idea to have the waterfront structures also looked at. If there's shorefront systems, for instance, if you've got a bulkhead or a revetment or something along those lines, it's not one and done. Those things really take a beating, with being in the rough environment, and they do require maintenance. So having, that's something that we do. We'll do an inspection and do a review of it. We'll look at all the environmental permits, make sure they're all in order, and then do a conditions assessment. So.
Thank you, John. And Karen, from your perspective, you're looking at, sometimes looking at the title in advance of a sale is probably worthwhile too.
Absolutely. And easy to do.
Because it's gonna come up. So again, there's a lot of steps that will make the process easier for you, and there's a group of people here that are highly trained professionals that have been doing this on the Cape for an awfully long time. And
I have one more piece of this very random information, but it's something that I find most sellers aren't aware of. And in Massachusetts, this may surprise you, but there's a tax on sellers when you sell your property, and this is paid at closing. The rate is set by the county. Barnstable County's rate is higher than most counties in Massachusetts. It's $6.48 per thousand. So on a $500,000 house, that's a $3,200 payment that is on the seller only. Some states, it's buyer only. Some states don't have them, and other states split it. But Massachusetts, it's seller no matter what. If you're selling within a family for $100 or less, there's no tax charged. But this isn't something that you have to come up with the money prior to closing for. It's on the settlement statement. It's deducted from your proceeds. But just something to be aware of, because it's a cost that comes up at the end that people weren't expecting.
I have a question on that. What if two people own a house and, say brother and sister or whatever, and one buys the other out for fair market value?
Or whatever the stated value in the deed is what the registry will use as the basis to determine the tax.
So you would pay half if you
No.
only had to pay half to the
But
other half?
Presumably, they're only paying half the value,
Correct.
and then the tax would be based on whatever it is they're paying. And then as the sibling that retains ownership goes to sell for the full value, they'll again pay a deed stamp based on the full value.
Okay.
So that's a great
It's
question.
just so small, but
Yeah.
it's,
How do you handle an association? An association has a dock, mostly nothing more than that, and a spot on the pond. How is that in your?
Well, yeah.
It's deed restricted.
Right, so I mean, again, the ownership would be probably underneath the association, and it would be registered as such, if, assuming that it had a license and so forth at the time. So again, it goes back to the, whoever the entity is that has ownership of that property. So if it's a condo association, is that what you're talking about? Or do you have a homeowner association?
Homeowners association.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, how does that affect your individual property, let's say? That could be something that's buried somewhere,
Or not.
maybe
Not
right, or
not even addressed.
Or not even
Yeah.
addressed, yeah.
Or sometimes, Karen, do you see them in where it's like you own 1/16 of a dock, and then you have to make sure that the person who owns the house is up to date with their association fees and things like that?
yeah, so
We ran into
ultimately
that
it's the
recently.
association fee, but it does have a trickle-down effect to you, because if you have a percentage interest in the association, which most likely you would, you're that percentage-wise responsible. I think it does come back to, was this addressed when the association was created, or was it addressed when the dock went in? And what I tend to see is no, that it hasn't been. And in some of these neighborhood associations, has not been addressed. Or at least there's nothing at the registry of deeds on record that tells us how it was to be done. And a lot of these were established 100 years ago. So
I guess the question is, have you ever seen that where maybe a closing got held up because a person had an ownership interest in an association asset of some sort? In this case, let's say it's a waterfront structure, there's a dock or something like that.
yeah, well, if you're representing seller, the line is, oh, it's Cape Cod, that's how we do it.
Yeah.
And if you're representing the buyer, you're like, no, I want this straightened out. So, yeah, it does happen. I think we might be coming across that issue with the property.
It's got value, to have the association.
Well, that's just it. If you're selling it, if we're marketing it as deeded rights to something, because that's what the seller has told us, that they've got deeded rights to something, and all of a sudden there's nothing in the deed, and it's kind of a handshake and a nod, that like, hey, we all kind of.
Which is a whole nother, you could still have legal rights to it by a prescriptive easement, because if it's something that, as the property owner, you have done over a period of time, you actually create a right. So, but in your situation, or in any neighborhood association, the biggest thing that you can do is, and even if it's just starting now, is document, have records as to when the associate, even if it's only meeting once a year, or even if there's no meeting, but people are paying dues, someone has got to start keeping those records. That's what holds us up,
Right.
is we find out there's a neighborhood association, and then we're all trying to scramble to figure out, well, wait a minute, who pays dues, or who's running this, or when did this start, and it's that kind of confusion that we have a hard time, as representing seller, convincing off-Cape attorneys that it's not that big of a deal. But
Yeah, I guess
again, if you're my buyer, it's a big deal.
Yeah, well, I guess the bottom line is, if you're representing that this is an asset that goes with the property. That, you know, I live in this neighborhood and I've got beach rights, or I've got a rights to this private dock, whatever, and then it finds out that no one's paid fees or anything like that, then maybe not, you know, maybe you can say that, but, you know, you may not, you know, unless that got straightened out.
Or you may owe some money.
That's right.
Yeah. It should be in your deed if you have deeded rights.
Any other questions?
Kind of off the subject, but you brought it up. You said there was a fan system you could use in basements versus the
Right.
dehumidifier. Do you have any
We
further
do, there's some
information?
information out there which I can give you, and I can give you the person's name
Dave can speak to that too.
after that,
Okay.
and it's actually not off the subject, it's a really good point, and it works really well, it's very inexpensive, and it just moves air around, and that's what you
Would
want.
you use it in addition to a dehumidifier?
You can,
or
yeah.
instead of?
Yes, both. You can do both. The dehumidifiers are a great thing to have, and more you're seeing them piped into a drain so that they're constantly going, and you can tell right away when people use their dehumidifier, when you walk in the basement or you walk in a house, you can tell.
Dave, can you speak to that fan system?
Yeah, so if you have a central air system or a ducted system, whether it's forced hot air or central air, they make components that connect to that system. It's a whole house dehumidifier. April Air is a company that comes to mind. And that is a phenomenal brand, and that can be ducted into your HVAC system. If you're going to just a unit, there are a number of inexpensive options, but believe it or not, during the appropriate seasons, opening a window is
It works just as well.
it's just as well. Put your screen down or open your storm, open your sashes, let the house breathe a bit. Again, back to ventilation, how your house is vented, a proper roof vent, proper eave vent, that all plays a role in it. But believe it or not, just opening your windows in the appropriate season helps. Mold will not grow unless it's stagnant air. If you're changing air, mold will not grow. You can have water, you want to remediate water because eventually you will have mold, but moisture is why mold grows. And so if you have a central air system, run it at a decent temperature and constantly change air. There's also, in terms of clean air quality, a HEPA filter. You'd be amazed by installing a $50 HEPA filter, what that can do to the air quality of the house. It can sometimes just turn the air over. It can actually take the pollutants, the pollens, the things out of the air, which, you know, help across the board with health. And, you know.
That's only going to work if you have a hot air system.
Yeah, so if you don't have a ducted system, there are systems that you can place in the basement that turn the air quality, pull in fresh air and extract air, or like if you have basement windows, they make ventilation units that get installed to that. They're fairly inexpensive.
And there is material outside for providing that fan
I
system.
think there's some gift bags out there, there's some chocolates over here, and there's lots of cookies there. Sharon and I are, you know, we're going to be here for a while, so you can ask any of us any questions you'd like. We certainly welcome, you know, at-home consultations to walk through your home and give you some tips and advice on what can be done. Because again, we gave you a lot of information today, and you might only need to do this much of all of we've talked about, but it's at least a good tool, because again, the way people buy things is very different today, and especially in the discretionary home market. It's really important to be ready, because you'll make more money at the end of the day. Like, you'll end up reaping the benefits of some of the homework beforehand. I encourage you to take the market reports home, because really, really great information. And
Do we have more of those that are on the tables?
I've got one here.
Kelsey, do we have extras or not?
And, yeah, I think that there should be a number, at least a couple.
I was just gonna show her.
If you're a couple, take one.
Thank you so much for
Thank you
coming.
very much for
Really,
coming
and
today.
we welcome
Really-
your feedback too.
Yeah, we
obviously,
really,
so